Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the first SmartHER News Family Meeting. It's the first annual family meeting. I already think it should be sort of a tradition that we do around Thanksgiving time, but maybe more often than that, because as I've been preparing for this family meeting, and I'll give you a little bit of a background about why we're having it in a moment, I thought to myself, this is actually something that could be really cool to do on a more regular basis with some really big topics and topic experts and really dig into some of these tough conversations that many of us are having, with our family and with our friends. I am going to make sure that we invite our folks in from Instagram to make sure that they get on. If you're listening to this later, what's great about this platform that we use a platform called StreamYard. I'm all about sharing information because oftentimes you could find something better or something, an improvement or something like that. It allows us to broadcast live on all the different social media platforms. And with that in mind, we're able to have a live broadcast simultaneously with a lot of different audiences, which is awesome. It also allows us to get some instant comments, which I think is really important for the news. So many times the news is just speaking at you and not with you. And really, if you're in journalism to be a reporter, we're here to gather information and then answer questions as they come up. So that's what I hope the next hour or so is like for us as we set the stage here for what could be, I hope, a very productive conversation as we enter into what can be a tricky time of year. It can be tricky because there's a lot of joy that comes with the holidays. There's also a lot of existential crisis. Am I projecting? Is that what's happening right now? What do you know? You're in the middle of the holidays and you're wondering, like, what happened to the last year? What's happening with the year to come? The family dynamics, the social relationships that everyone is trying to navigate on a regular basis, and then you throw in an election and a president-elect in a couple weeks, and a lot of things happening in the news, and the dynamic can be more challenging than normal. And I know through the last several years, especially through the pandemic, we all had to navigate a lot of really tough, strange conversations that we likely didn't expect to have at any point in our life. Now we're prepped a little bit and we know what's coming. So I thought let's have a family meeting. One of the reasons this came up is because of so many of you sharing such heartfelt and important stories with me, which I always really appreciate. And it was not only just you, it was my own family and friends group that after the election shared with me that so many of these different political conversations were leading to real breaks, but felt like really significant breaks in relationships. We all can fall out with family and friends occasionally, can't we? But then sometimes you have a conversation with someone and you think, wait a minute, have we ever been on the same page? Do we actually share the same values? What is this relationship even about? And when you're having those questions, along with just trying to have a kind of daily rapport with someone, that can be really tough. And we know in the holidays, we're going to be in close proximity to each other. So I thought part of the problem and part of the reason we're arriving at this place where we feel that our relationships are so bogged down or impacted by the political moment is because of the media. Because depending on what news source you watch on a regular basis, you have a completely different picture of the world. You're being told a different story. And if you've been told that story over and over again, this is really the power of news. If you've been told a story over and over again, and you see yourself in that story, to break out of it and pick up a different story is really hard to do. That's just naturally. It has to have nothing to do with the headlines or the news that we're seeing on a regular basis. But if you have families that are actually seeing completely different sources of news that are more and more partisan, then to try to back out of that and actually listen to someone that has a completely different story going in their mind is just difficult. It's just human nature. And so really, I do believe the solution for this is stronger, more robust, nonpartisan news platforms, because then we have access to a common story. And then the commentary becomes what we sprinkle in. We could think of it sort of like a Thanksgiving feast. You got to come someplace for some of the basics. We know there's going to be some turkey on the table. You got a little gravy, maybe mashed potato. You got to have some of the basics. And then everybody brings their own style, right? Their own cultural backgrounds. My Thanksgiving table always had raviolis on it. Or if I was really lucky, my grandmother made gnocchis from total scratch. And that's where you get the Thanksgiving table to look really unique. And that's where we get conversations that look really interesting because you have oh, wait, I never even thought about that. That's such an interesting idea. Totally don't agree with it, but I'm actually sort of fascinated by that. And that's that's the dynamic that we should embrace. And especially in a free society where we have a free press, where we're able to say what we think, where we have so many different modalities of expressing ourselves. This could really be a celebration rather than a conflict. So how do we reach that? How do we reach that destination? And I really think a family meeting is part of that. I think the term safe space is probably overused and politicized a little bit. In some ways, what I'm trying to say is this is common ground. And I want you to be able to speak freely about some of the questions that you have and curiosities about different topics in the effort to try to understand different points of view. And so that's what the family meeting is about. I'm calling this family meeting to order. I thought I was going to Amazon a gavel. Didn't get here in time, but I feel like I need a gavel next time. I'll call the family meeting to order. And then I have a series of different questions from you that are really tough. Let me start there for a second, too. Some of these, I always try to broadcast the news in a way that a family doesn't have to worry about having a television on. I remember, especially with the news, since I worked in the news for so long and then I had little kids, if you have the news on, even if it's like Good Morning America or the Today Show, you don't know when that next horrible crime story is coming up. And this actually happened to me the other day when I was watching a program with my daughter. I just happened to have it on and a story came on about September 11th. And I didn't want to shy away from that tough topic, but it was pretty graphic and I needed to sit with her and really pay attention. If I was in the other room and I wasn't paying attention, that's what could be tough with when it comes to news broadcasting in a family atmosphere. I like to make this very family friendly. I just want to give you a little bit of a warning. The questions that you had are really about the topics that are the ones that are really burning right now in society. These are the tough topics. These are topics about abortion and gay marriage, immigration, crimes. And so if you have younger ears, it's just kind of a word to wise. I like to give you a little bit of a heads up on that. I always think, could my 10-year-old be in this room? I'm like, my 10-year-old probably could, but I probably would choose not to because, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to cover a lot of ground. And I probably want to slow down for almost every single one of these topics if I was to explain it to someone that was a little bit younger. Let me also start here quickly, too, with a little breaking news, which I think also only underscores why what we're doing at SmartHER News really matters. And then we're going to get to your questions. So just before we came on the air here, we're recording this just a week before Thanksgiving, appropriately so. And we got this breaking news that one of the nominees for President-elect's cabinet has withdrawn his name. The nominee was former Congressman Matt Gaetz. He was nominated for Attorney General. There was a lot of controversy that was surrounding this nomination. And quite frankly, there was a lot of controversy around Matt Gaetz in general for his time in Congress. And let me just show you I'm going to just pull this up here so you can see it. This is what he ended up putting on Twitter just a few minutes ago. Let me get it even bigger for you. And what he says here in this statement is, and I'll read a couple sentences from it. He said, I had excellent meetings with senators yesterday. I appreciate their thoughtful feedback and the incredible support of so many. He goes on, while the momentum was strong, it is clear that my confirmation was unfairly becoming a distraction to the critical work of the Trump-Vance transition. There is no time to waste on a needlessly protracted Washington scuffle. Thus, I'll be withdrawing my name from consideration to serve as Attorney General. This is just a couple things just to kind of weed through that statement. The senators, there are ways that the president a president-elect, and when they become president, can try to work through nominees without the Senate going through a whole hearing process and the question and answer period and all of that. It's a moment for the senators as our representatives to really get to know these different nominees. It's very seldom that the Senate will say, yeah, that guy can't serve or that woman can't serve. If we look at historic precedent, it's harder, let me back up, to try to sidestep that process, although there's a way to do it when someone's coming in with a lot of controversy, because then you're looking like you're purposely avoiding any sort of questions with the Senate. So the fact that Matt Gaetz was talking about the Senate, one could surmise whatever happened in those conversations with the senators, some of whom would be asking him questions on a national stage about his past or behavior, gave an indication that this wasn't going to go well. And maybe he could have made it through, but we don't know what the cost would have been in this sort of exchange. So this is interesting news to get, and a reminder too about some of the editorial choices we're making at SmartHER News. Over the last week, there's been some questions from some of you that have been a little critical of my decision not to go deeper on dives of what's happening with these different cabinet nominees. And the reason I've chosen not to do that is because there's some real news happening in the world that I actually think should be prioritized. And I found that the media was getting very seduced by this conversation over cabinet nominees, and all these other big stories were happening. Listen, it's interesting how what a new administration is going to look like. Absolutely. Character matters, leadership style matters, all these things matter. But I didn't want to prioritize that conversation over the news that could really impact you. And I'm thinking about, wow, think about the last week. How much time has been dedicated to talking about Matt Gaetz's nomination for Attorney General that could have been spent looking at inflation or mortgage rates that still are fairly high, or what's happening in Ukraine, or what's happening in Gaza, or any of these other stories that could potentially affect you. I have to show you this as I was looking for Matt Gaetz's statement. I thought you would find this interesting. I found in his former congressman account the Gaetz Network live stream. So he already has about 3 million followers on his former congressman account. Oh, do you want to hear what he has to say? Let's see if I could do it.
So make sure that you go to our website, gaetz.house.gov. There you can sign.
I'm like, just like traditional media, guys, we're actually doing something different. Okay. So there you go. What I'm saying is Matt Gaetz may be coming to a screen near you, or clearly already has. And so there you are. In the meantime, I want to focus on things that really impact you and your family, really prioritize you. And some of the editorial choices we make at SmartHER News look a lot different than those in traditional or mainstream media, but it's with the intention of really being thoughtful. If you have 30 seconds to 3 minutes, how do we actually give you value? What does that actually look like? How do we get the trust back of the American public? And how do we deliver quick, concise, nonpartisan information for the things that really can impact you in that 24, 48-hour period or even beyond that? So a little bit of news. And I think now we're ready to jump into some of the questions. And please, as you're seeing things that come up, maybe you're seeing there's something on the live chat, or you have some additional questions on a certain topic, please go ahead and throw those into the comment section. It's sort of like a call-in show without the phone line, which I think we should probably figure out. I believe there's technology for that. So we have things that we can actually put in place. The one other thing I want to mention, this is my final disclaimer, and then we'll be done with it, is that I was thinking about this earlier because some of these conversations can feel so emotional. We're dealing with really emotional topics. I'm going to try to be very intentional about my language and be very straightforward. I don't want that straightforwardness to be misinterpreted as apathy to these topics. These are all topics that have definitely come up in conversation for all of us, and they're emotional, and that's okay. So I'm just going to try to be as straightforward and clear as possible with the two different sides or two different points of view on a very controversial topic, give you a little background, and hopefully answer some of your questions. So before we get started, though, Whitney gave us a great question. Whitney told us on the live chat on YouTube that she's actually sitting, is it in a Delta lounge, Whitney? I wasn't sure exactly where you were headed to. Whitney has a new little baby, Iris, so cute. See, we get to know you guys. If you're Scoop insiders, you join a live broadcast once a week, and then we get to know you. We get to know your families. It's actually a lot of fun. We're sharing Thanksgiving recipes next week. So if you're interested in any of that, it's usually just the news. But because it's Thanksgiving, we're doing something fun. Robin shared a great recipe with us. So we're going to package that into an email for everybody so we could share our Thanksgiving recipes on Monday. You can go to scoop.smarthernews.com. And it's a great way to support us for basically the price of a cup of coffee once a month. And it's a fun community. So Whitney had jumped on. She's traveling, and she actually sent in this question. This is not a issue specific question, but because it's a broad question, I thought it was actually a great way to start, and I'd love you to hear what she had to say.
Hi, Jenna. This is Whitney and Iris, and we are going to my family in Tennessee for Thanksgiving this year. And I'm excited. This is the first holiday with a grandchild for them, so it's going to be great. However, my dad and I sometimes butt heads when it comes to politics, even though we're on the same side. We are both conservative, but I've done a lot of traveling. I've lived in DC for the last 16 years or so, and I just see things a little differently. I really value balance and looking for the other side and seeing where the other side is coming from. And I just have a hard time having a political discussion with him in those ways, but also because I'm his daughter, right? He needs to tell me what I need to think. At least that's what he wants to do. And I just really struggle with that. And I think it's probably pretty common, especially of fathers with daughters. And I just wanted to bring this up because I think the answer to this might help other people, including me and including Iris, eventually when she starts talking. So how do you handle that? How do you handle being on the same side as somebody, but they're so far on that other side, on that one side, that it feels like you're on opposing sides?
Tricky. Isn't that interesting? It's such an interesting question. By the way, Whitney told me she's not in a Delta lounge. She's in United. Apologies, Whitney. I know this is important. One of the things that was so interesting about Whitney, what Whitney had to say is I think it's really emblematic of our times. Previously we thought, oh, we have two sides and you have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and these are very clear. And one of the things we've seen in recent years is like, it's not that clear. There's lots of different shades of red in the Republican Party, and there's lots of different shades of blue in the Democratic Party. And then you got all this purple somewhere in between where people are like, yeah, so there seems to be this evolution of what's happening in the United States where you could actually be in the same party as someone and vehemently disagree on a couple key issues, but still feel like you're under this umbrella because there's not another option. Maybe we get to a place where we see a lot of different political parties. We haven't seen that really. A variety of times in our history, we've seen different ones pop up, but not in a real way in modern times that looks like it could be a challenge to the current two-party system. I know a lot of you don't like that system. I'm just kind of pointing it out. One of the things I think is really helpful for conversations like the one, Whitney, that you're having is our slogan. It's our mantra, curiosity over commentary. When someone's saying something that you so clearly disagree with, it's so easy to just want to share your opinion. It's the commentary that comes through rather than the question. And I'm going to give you a little interview tip in a second. It could be, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that? Or, oh, where did that come? Where did you hear that? It's instead of leading with a comment at the Thanksgiving table or just in casual conversation, it's, oh, ask a question. First of all, people like being asked questions in general, and they like having a little more time to explain themselves. But also you may hear something that you didn't even realize, even from family members, where if you ask them about something and you realize, oh, there's something so much deeper in this for you than I thought. You were just angry over the latest, debate that we saw on social media. And this goes back years for you because you had this one experience. And I didn't even realize, I didn't even ask you enough questions about that to understand how passionately you could feel about this certain topic. And it's really an interesting way to diffuse what feels right away like an aggressive situation. Because we also want to make sure that we get our point of view across, and we want to feel heard just as much as that person who liked being asked the question. But leading with curiosity is very helpful in personal conversations, professional as well. Imagine how many meeting rooms you've been in, and I've been guilty of this. This is how I arrived at this, is because I've made this mistake. You're having a debate amongst team members, and right away people are kind of jostling, posturing for positions. And it's like, if you lead with a question, instantly you're learning more about why they came up with that, perhaps even equipping yourself with more information to refute it. But either way, you're in a better position than if you just lead with your commentary, because you're gaining information that could be really helpful to you, helpful to just understand that person or understand how to refute them. So I think that's one thing just to think about, like the power of a question, especially in a free society, is immeasurable. Curiosity is really the key to so many different things, remaining curious rather than judgmental about it. The other thing I would say is one of the lessons I've learned, Whitney, over the years, listening to this guy, speaking of controversial, he was controversial at times. His name was Don Imus. He was a radio show host, and he was one of the, big radio show hosts for decades when it came to all sorts of different music. And in the last part of his career, he was brought into Fox Business to host a simulcast because Fox Business didn't have a lot of viewers. And they were like, how do you bring in viewers? Okay, we're going to use a radio show and then put a little business news in it and get momentum to start our day. It's kind of an interesting concept. So I did the news on his show. And so I would watch him sit down with a lot of famous people because they all knew him from decades of working with him on the radio. And, people like Dolly Parton, for example, all sorts of different lawmakers would come in, athletes, they like talking to him. And one of the reasons they like talking to him is that he would do something like this. He would let them, sometimes he would be very controversial. That was, then you knew you had to steer clear. But one of the tools he taught me as an interviewer is 3 little words. Tell me more. He would often have someone talk about something and then he'd be like, huh, tell me more about that. And instantly he would get something that no one else learned because the person would sit back and tell him a little bit more about that. So I would encourage you, Whitney, to kind of think about that with your dad. We all think that we know our family members so well, but maybe there's some other reasons why he feels so passionately on these certain topics. Maybe not, but maybe there is. And I think just kind of putting yourself in that posture, being like, I'm going to be really curious about this. I'm almost going to, approach this as a reporter for SmartHER News and report back. That can really help. Those are 2 little tips I think could be interesting just to try. And when all else fails, you got to put that baby in the stroller, bundle up and take a walk. Because what is my good friend Mel has a great comment. She said, oh gosh, she's going to kill me because she says this and it's so good and I'm going to screw it up. But it's basically like movement will change your mood. And I think that's also true at the holidays. You got to get moving and then you reset. So just a couple little things. We can try that as we tackle some of the really tough topics that we're going to turn to next. So here's that way that we're going to go today. We're going to talk a little bit about President-elect Trump. We're going to talk about his criminal cases. We're going to talk about accusations. We're going to talk about abortion, multiple questions about abortion, female healthcare in general. We're going to talk a little bit about gay marriage as well. And then we have a couple other questions if we get to it. And we're going to try to move through this as fast as we possibly can. Any one of these topics could easily cover an hour. But what I'm trying to do is take a topic, and if someone says this, then here's what I think you should know about this, and try to even out some of what we're kind of hearing out of as I like to say, out of the corner of our ears rather than kind of really understanding. So here's it. Let's jump into the deep end first. Kendra wrote in and said, I have an acquaintance who is ending all friendships, family relationships with anyone who voted for Trump, stating that he is a sexual predator and she can't have a relationship with anyone who would want him in charge. Also saying he is appointing other sexual predators, for example, Matt Gaetz. Just talked about that. I understand what she's saying if the allegations are true, but it felt like voters' hands were tied, bringing it back to the double dislikers, she said, LOL. So this is, by the way, very emblematic of many of the different comments that you wrote in saying, my relationship is severed because the person that I was just talking to said that anyone that voted for President-elect Trump is a horrible person. Who doesn't share the same values, can't be in the same room with them, kind of these more, I don't say severe, but it sounds severe of saying we're cutting off these relationships. You're going to hear another example of this in a question later on. So let me clarify this a little bit. And this is tough, but I think it's important to know a lot of what we're going to do is back away and just kind of look at, well, what are some of the basic things that we should know about, like the criminal system or how someone is prosecuted. What does that actually look like? And to understand that will give us some more clarity on this question of like, why they say Trump is a rapist. So here's the top 3 things I think you should know about this. President-elect Trump was never convicted of rape nor charged with that crime, meaning he was never criminally prosecuted for allegations of rape, period. That's never happened. He's never been criminally prosecuted for that particular crime. He was found liable in civil court for sexual abuse. And there's a really big difference between criminal prosecution and civil prosecution. It may or may not matter to you depending on your point of view. But just as point of public knowledge, in a criminal court, crimes are prosecuted by government actors, the Fed, for example, the state, local police. The standard of proof required, as many of you know, is beyond a reasonable doubt. As a jury, you have to come to that. Beyond a reasonable doubt, this person is guilty. There can't be one person thinking that maybe not. Everybody has to say beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant is either found guilty, which means they're culpable for that crime, or they're found innocent. And those are the 2 options. In a civil lawsuit, the lawsuits are filed by individuals or businesses, so not law enforcement. An individual can be in a civil case. The standard of proof is a preponderance of the evidence. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a preponderance of the evidence. A jury can decide this person is liable or not liable, not guilty or not guilty, not guilty or innocent. It's liable or not liable. And that's what happens in a civil case. So for President-elect Trump, he was found liable in a civil case with what was eventually what the jury found is sexual abuse. So that language is also important. It was sexual abuse, not rape. If you want to look into some of the details of this case and some of the different allegations, you might be able to weed through why that was used versus rape. And I'm just skirting that topic a little bit here just because I don't want to get into the graphic nature of it. But you likely can surmise a little bit of what I'm saying. Rape is very specific. In this civil case, it was sexual abuse. Why do people say that Trump is a rapist? Is because of accusations that have happened that predate this too. So it's not just about this particular case, but in this particular case, the civil lawsuit that was brought by E. Jean Carroll in 2022, so this is the most recent one, was tried in Manhattan, or was heard by a jury in Manhattan, 9 men and 3 women, and they found by a preponderance of the evidence that Trump sexually abused Carroll, and there was therefore liable for that specifically. So the accusations or the description of President-elect Trump has to do with that now. So when we're thinking about that, that's where some of the more recent accusations come from. But if we go back several years or even go back several decades in the past, there has been a variety of different accusations that have been made about President-elect Trump. Those accusations, though, have not been prosecuted. And that can mean several things, by the way. We don't have all the information for any sort of a case. So and I'm just giving you different scenarios here. In some cases, and you could see that, well, there was, maybe this is what the hush money trial was about, by the way. If we look at, which we're going to get to in a Manhattan courtroom, there can be money exchange in exchange for silence about any, we don't really know any of the particulars. And that's what makes this difficult. So if someone wants to say he is a rapist or he is a sexual predator, they could be referencing several different things. They could be referencing their understanding of what happened in a court, and they could be potentially confusing criminal prosecution and civil liability, or not, may not matter to them. They could also be referencing accusations that have gone back many, many years about President-elect Trump's behavior. And that comes to the different accounts of different women who have come forward, either on the record or not. But those accusations, many of them, although they exist in the media space, have not matured to the place or did not pursue legal prosecution. So those are the important things that we need to know about that, because the reason why we're talking about it has to do with actual legal action that happened recently, but that legal action is very specific and it is different than criminal prosecution. There are accusations that have not been met with criminal prosecution that again may or may not matter to someone, but just as a point of clarification, I think that's important just to be aware of. So that's some of the questions that we have about President Trump and that specific accusation. There's been a lot of questions about whether or not, and this is an interesting one. I got one on Instagram, which was, is President Trump actually a felon? Like, we keep on hearing that term. Is he a felon? Like when people say he's a rapist, he's a fraud, he's a felon. Like, what are they talking about? So remember, there are 4 different criminal cases that have been levied against President-elect Trump. 2 of them are federal cases, and 2 of them have to do with specific state cases. The state case in New York is the hush money trial that we have referenced time and time again over the last several years. And he was found guilty in this particular case, criminal prosecution, of felonies. That was before the election. And that was also before a really critical Supreme Court ruling that said essentially that a president has some immunity for certain actions that he takes in office. And there's this lingering question over this case about whether evidence that was presented before this ruling can actually still be omitted, should be omitted in the case, or should be allowed to be presented as evidence. The judge was taking a look at this, asking this question, considering this new Supreme Court decision, is some of this evidence, would it have not been allowed because it was a text message that happened when the president was in office, or it was an exchange that happened related to this event while he was serving as president? What would that mean for this prosecution? President Trump's team has asked for a variety of different ways to get this case essentially dismissed, or this verdict overturned, saying it needs to be retried. We can't just let it stand. And also, by the way, he's president-elect, and there's no precedent for sentencing a president-elect or prosecuting a president-elect. So there's a lot of reasons why this should just go away. The defense disagrees with that. He says, no, wait a minute. This is like, we tried this in a court of law, and a jury of his peers said that he is criminally guilty of these crimes. He's a felon. So as of right now, President-elect Trump is a felon. He's a felon. He hasn't been sentenced. And depending on how the judge rules on this question about whether or not this case should be retried or changed in any way, he may be a previously convicted felon. In the future, if for some reason the case is overturned, he would lose that label. It would never change the fact that at one point he was convicted, but it would also give the other side the opportunity to say, yeah, but it was overturned, so really we shouldn't refer to him that way. It's very interesting right now, the Judge Mershon in Manhattan. He has put a couple of deadlines down. It was last Tuesday and it was this Tuesday to come forward and say, this is what's going to happen with this case once and for all. And he's missed both deadlines. And basically the sentencing was supposed to happen next week, right before Thanksgiving. And what we were reading through some of the legalese of it today. And basically it's like, I'm just summarizing it for you. That's not going to happen. And we're just pausing everything right now for a second. That's kind of where it's at. So you could wake up tomorrow and get a decision from the judge that says, oh, this case is going to be overturned, that the verdict's going to be overturned, the case can be retried by prosecutors or not, or whatever it is. You could wake up to that news, or I don't know if it could sort of stay at this strange place where you have the prosecutors and the defense filing different motions, asking the judge for different things, but never actually reaching a sentence stage. And in this sort of weird purgatory place, the president-elect remains a convicted felon. You see what I'm saying? So he's paused there. He's almost frozen in time there. He's a convicted felon that has not been sentenced. And he's a convicted felon where the prosecutors are asking for that verdict to be overturned. It's tricky. I know. Tricky is going to be the word of the day. We should have a drinking game with tea, not with anything else. I knew what you were thinking, but it's going to be a little bit tricky. Any questions on that? Because it is a very tough topic there. And I know there's a lot of things to work through. So if you see anything, I'd love to just hear from you. Jamie, I appreciate this. Jenna, I wish you had the capacity to do this type of walkthrough on everything. I mean, I'd love to do it through everything. I mean, that's the point. I was a journalist. Like, that's how I became that. Tracy's asking, I've heard people say that those charges would normally be a misdemeanor. There's been all sorts of different debate about this case in New York that has actually been tried. So for the other cases, the two criminal cases that are federal cases, by the first week of December, the special prosecutor has said, so this is something just to be aware of. You get through Thanksgiving weekend, you do all your shopping, then you have Cyber Monday. After Cyber Monday, the special prosecutor from the Department of Justice said that they're going to come out and say what they're going to do with these cases, because these cases that are about the handling of classified documents, that case was previously in a Florida court. It's a federally prosecuted, but in a Florida court. That case is now being looked at by another court as a request for an appeal by the special prosecutor went through because the previous judge just basically dismissed it. And then you have this other federal case that's in Washington, D.C. that's about election interference and fraud. Essentially, that's what the special prosecutor is saying about President-elect Trump's actions during 2020. Then you have this case in Georgia that is also about election interference. So by after Cyber Monday, you should have the special prosecutor telling us whether or not he's going to just drop these cases because President-elect Trump is president-elect, or going to freeze them, or we have like no idea. We've never seen this before. Like this has never happened. No one has any idea how this is going to go. If that's helpful in any of your conversations, you can be like, yeah, we never seen this before. And you'd be right because no one has any idea how this has happened. And what no one has any idea, I shouldn't say, of how this has happened. How this has happened is very clear. The government saw that there was a case. A judge said, yeah, this case can go forward, and the case is going forward until that same prosecutor can say, yeah, I don't know if we really have this case anymore. So that's where it stands. So in the case in Manhattan, there were questions about whether or not these sort of crimes would be typically, or these sort of allegations would get the attention essentially that they did. And that's where President Trump's team was like, this would never happen to anybody else. These were misdemeanors at most. This isn't even a crime, they would argue. And this is kind of a nothing burger. Obviously the courts there disagreed and a jury disagreed. So even though there would be maybe the opportunity to try it in a different way, that's not what happens. So that's what we have right now. I just see a question about, would the slide be recorded and posted later? Yes, it will. And a great way for you to receive it is just to sign up for our weekend newsletter, which is free. If you just go to our bio on social media, it's there, or it's also on our website in how to support SmartHER News. So thank you so much. I see Sooner Stacy saying, I've never heard this explained like this before. I hope that's a good thing. I want the explanation to be helpful, but it's a lot of words to get out at one time. So I'll make sure that we make sure that we save this and get this to you in a few different forms. But that's a great way that we can just make sure to get it delivered to you directly. All right, should we move on to abortion and women's health care? It's a big topic, and we got a lot to cover. So if you guys are ready for it, I think we can go for it. And I think there's some really important ground to cover here and some really important questions. The first thing I want to just talk to you about abortion, and we got to be really careful with, and I can see I can fall into some of these habits because it's just kind of natural. The terms that we're using, pro-life, anti-abortion, reproductive rights, abortion advocates, all these things can be actually politically loaded terms. Reproductive rights is a term that also could be women's health care. Those that say that they're anti-abortion will, some would call anti-abortion, will say, I'm not anti-abortion, I'm just pro-life. So these are, terms you got to be really careful with. Some people will say when we're talking about abortion, we'll talk about a fetus. Some will call the same object a baby. And we just have to have an honest conversation about this. What I tend to use if that topic comes up is to use the term unborn, because I'm trying to figure out a way to use something that's more neutral, but that also causes some other controversies. So just know that the language here is also a little bit of an obstacle. The other thing I want to mention to you is that we just need to get an understanding of the way that our legislative branch, our executive branch, and our judicial branch work. So Congress is going to legislate for federal laws. Our representatives are there. They're going to legislate for federal laws that could impact us as citizens. The state legislates state laws that are going to impact us when we live in that particular state. The Supreme Court is going to decide if any of these laws, if they're given the opportunity, violate your constitutional rights. Broadly, what the whole purpose of the Supreme Court is to uphold the Constitution. So if there's a question about whether or not your constitutional rights are being violated in any way, or a question about a constitutionality of a law, it's going to go before the Supreme Court, period. So that's really important to know that the Supreme Court is the backstop for that particular issue. And while a president has a certain amount of power, executive power, and Congress has a certain amount of power, legislative power, the Supreme Court is there to protect the Constitution. And that's what the Supreme Court is constantly looking at. So I say this because there's a couple big cases that we all know that are related to abortion. I just want to quickly go through those. So we have a kind of a similar foundation. One of the issues with how future laws are being applied, and a challenge to discussing that, is a lack of common understanding of what the laws previously said. And if we have common ground of understanding, well, what are these laws? Then when we're building upon that, wondering how the story is going to develop next, we're coming from a common place. And so I think this is really important. A case that you will likely know is a case Roe v. Wade. That was a case in 1973. Oftentimes, Roe v. Wade is referred to as the Supreme Court decision that secured your right to an abortion. But this did not guarantee the unfettered right to an abortion at any time in a pregnancy. That's not what this guaranteed. And I say this slowly because as a woman existing in America, I think I did previously walk around and think I have the constitutional right to an abortion. I did have a constitutional right to access that health care in a certain part of my pregnancy. That's always been the law. It's never been unfettered. And it always has been that your state had a role in deciding what would happen during part of your pregnancy. That was part of Roe v. Wade. Uh, Roe v. Wade provided the right to an abortion up to a certain point, which we called viability in pregnancy, and provided leeway for states to restrict or permit the procedure in how they felt fit. So that's a way that the Supreme Court deferred to the state and said the constitutional right is there, but we also think the state has a role here. And here's how we're going to do this. We're going to say this right is confirmed, but then we're also going to let the states decide somewhat of just exactly what that looks like at different parts of the pregnancy. It's important to note here that this ruling centered around a person's right to privacy as inferred by the Constitution, not the procedure itself. So the actual procedure of abortion wasn't when the Supreme Court issued this decision, the argument was about the right to privacy and the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and the right to be able to be a person of agency where you're going to make some of your own decisions that the government's not involved with. The right to privacy was really central here to this particular ruling. A few years later, you had a different case that came out that reached the Supreme Court. And this is a really important one. We don't talk about it as much. Is the Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey or v. Casey. What this did, the Supreme Court had abortion in front of it. Again, basically the state of Pennsylvania really wanted to put these extra restrictions on those who could seek abortion. And so the Supreme Court was like, okay, is the state like what's going on here? Like if this constitutional right, but the state's trying to do this and now this is in front of us. So were we wrong about Roe v. Wade? Like how do we, there was a big question about would Roe v. Wade stand? And the Supreme Court said, yes, Roe v. Wade stands, but they narrowed they narrowed Roe v. Wade. So they basically said, yes, the constitutional right still exists, but we're going to narrow this and allow the states to further put in some of their own restrictions or permissions. We're going to empower the states a little bit more in this process, but we're going to keep Roe v. Wade. And part of their argument for that was that it was precedent, that the Supreme Court had already done it, and they're not going to overturn what was precedent from the Supreme Court because that's really has never been done before, especially with something that was deemed a constitutional right. Then we're going to go to 2022. So it's really important is like in the second case, women still had a right to an abortion early in pregnancy. That still was maintained. But there was a more flexible medical definition of viability. So different states started to say, well, the pregnancy could be viable at 18 weeks. So we're going to start putting laws in effect that start then. Or maybe 15 weeks. And that's what Mississippi did. So Mississippi came in and was like, okay, well, cool. So then we're going to restrict abortion at 15. Like you can get an abortion up to 15 weeks and then you can't get an abortion. And that instantly caused another legal battle that wound up in the Supreme Court, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And this is where the Supreme Court did something unprecedented. They took a look at Roe v. Wade. They took a look at all the different abortion rulings that had come up in a variety of different ways. And they said, basically, Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court was wrong. And what they said is that there is not a constitutional right to something that's not explicitly stated in the Constitution. That although the argument was in the past that it's my right to privacy that protects this constitutional right to pursue this procedure, that doesn't really stand here, that the right to privacy doesn't actually ensure that. And it's really up to the states to decide that. It's not really up to the federal government to confirm that constitutional right to access. And so what Roe v. Wade did, what the Supreme Court did to Roe v. Wade in this situation is overturn it so that constitutional right at a certain point in the pregnancy no longer exists. And now the states are able to legislate as the states see fit. And that's why we have all different sort of state laws now. It is also true that after Roe v. Wade, we had all different state laws too. It's just that extra constitutional protection that protected a certain period of the pregnancy. I think it's really important to understand this. I felt very confused about this. And again, as a woman, thought, wow, that's so interesting. Like what I was thinking of the perception of it wasn't exactly what I thought. And it matters because of how this law is evolving, understanding the evolution of it. So one of the interesting things about this particular case, which is going to lead us for a further conversation here, is because of this argument about the constitutional right to an abortion was based upon privacy. Other laws that use that argument were instantly called into question. Well, what about a right to contraception? What about the right to gay marriage? That really was about personal agency because it's about privacy. One of the legal arguments for that. There are many. It wasn't just like people were theorizing about that. It's that the Supreme Court justices, one of them in particular, Justice Clarence Thomas, wrote about it. And he wanted to weigh in on this issue and said, this is an interesting ruling because it calls into question some of these other laws that exist out there. And this is why that was sparked. It wasn't just hypothetical, legal analysts saying, well, if this is done for abortion, like maybe it could be done for this other stuff. No, the Supreme Court justices were like, yeah, maybe this could be done for this other stuff. Like that's how that all came up. So it's not just, people are worrying about things. No. The justices actually mentioned it. So the reason why, and we have a couple questions about this, and I'm going to get to several of your questions about abortion. The way that President Trump fits into all of this, because the questions that many of you had is like, how is President Trump responsible for killing Roe? He's taking away women's rights. He did it. He's responsible for our lack of constitutional rights today. Because of him, he did it. Now you can see what I just described to you doesn't involve anything that President Trump did in those particular cases. But what President Trump did have action and a role in is being able to appoint Supreme Court justices. And for years, amongst conservative circles or those that advocated for this particular position, which is to really narrow or do away with the constitutional right to an abortion. Part of the goal was, or the thinking was, can you get justices that would be more sympathetic to that position that Roe v. Wade was just wrong? And if you get them in court with a certain dynamic where you have more of those sort of justices thinking about the interpretation of the Constitution in that way, can Roe be overturned? And one of the things that President-elect Trump talked about in his first term is doing just that. Appointing Supreme Court justices that would be more benevolent to this particular perspective. And therefore, if a challenge was before the court, then perhaps this particular law would be overturned. A lot of things had to happen for that to take place, in that there had to be a challenge to Roe v. Wade that matured enough to get to the Supreme Court when those Supreme Court justices were in place. And that's exactly what happened. The case in Mississippi started in 2018. And by the time it reached the Supreme Court in 2022, even though President-elect Trump was out of office, the Supreme Court justices that he appointed were there. And that's how people put him into that bucket to say he's responsible for that. He would also not shy away from the fact that he was responsible for those appointments and has taken credit for doing away with Roe v. Wade. So he's spoken about that. But I want you to understand the process there, just so that we also understand future executive action and executive power, to know that when these challenges come up, the legal challenges have to reach a certain stage of maturity at just the time when you have a certain slate of Supreme Court justices in order to even entertain different outcomes. And so I think that's important to note. One of the things that President-elect Trump has said repeatedly is that he would not sign a federal abortion ban. And you have likely heard different things about this. People may say, oh, well, he says that, but we don't know what he's going to do. That's certainly true. We have no idea what this new Congress is going to do. And we really don't know what President-elect Trump is going to do when he's in office. All things are on the table, right? We don't know if circumstances change. Someone starts thinking about their legacy and they decide, why not? Let's sign it. Let's get it through Congress. First of all, it'd have to get through Congress. And an executive action, would be an unprecedented territory. That would be, I don't even know how it could be enforced. Like there's all sorts of different questions about that. But legislation passed through Congress that the president signed would need enough lawmakers to support that. And then eventually to get to his desk, he would have to agree to sign it as it comes to him. Even with that and the power behind that and momentum behind that, there still could be a Supreme Court challenge to it. Just because lawmakers do it and the president doesn't mean that someone can't say, "Oh, no, we're going to challenge that in court." The issue is the timeline of getting a case like that in front of the Supreme Court. And it probably would be expedited, but you never know. So here's a really heartfelt question I got from John. And John, I really appreciate this that you wrote in. So let me read it. It's a little bit long, but I think this is going to really resonate with so many of you. John wrote me this. I'm sorry to send you a DM, but this is a very touchy subject for my daughter, but I really wanted you to consider this subject. My daughter has gone through several miscarriages over the past few years, and it has impacted her in so many ways. As her dad, it breaks my heart. She was brought up in a Christian home where abortion was considered morally wrong. After one of her miscarriages, her doctor made her wait several days before doing a procedure because our state has an abortion ban. This raised her risk of infection and seems completely unnecessary. My question is, are doctors being deceived that they risk losing their license or other malpractice lawsuits in the treatment of miscarriages? It seems like the system is causing unnecessary risks in order to demonize states that have abortion bans. It seems to me to be very clear decisions 98% of the time when it's safest to perform the treatment for a miscarriage. Because of this, my daughter suffered so much more anxiety and has changed her views. I would love to share with her the real story as to what doctors are legally bound to do in such situations. I really appreciate you, John, for sending this in. This is a really tough question to answer without more information. And it's tough because it really depends on the state. And the state laws, there's what we talked about, the Supreme Court ruling and the decision. That empowered the states to make their own laws. And as we stand here on the verge of going to 2025, so the ruling happened for Roe v. Wade and the overturn of it in 2022. So now we're almost 3 years down the road from that. We're just seeing some of the state law mature to the point where there's some more clarity on it. What exactly is going on? Even if it was put in place even before this ruling in 2022, where there was a stricter standard for abortion, whether or not it would be enforced or what it was looking like in a practical measure was probably a little bit all over the place. Were police or law enforcement, how were they approaching this topic? How was anyone approaching this topic before this ruling in 2022? And then afterwards with the states with the new laws, like how does it actually get applied? So part of what we're seeing just on a basic level with medical care is some confusion. And although there could be a good legal argument for your daughter's doctor slowing down perhaps some care that in other situations would have been provided to her immediately to ask a question, might be part of this process right now for that particular doctor who, let's just assume the best in people, love your daughter and want to care for her, and also maybe being told that they're going to lose their license for making the wrong decision. And it's very tough here because in certain states, again, there's different ways of saying, well, abortion is prohibited except for the overall physical health of the mother or a life or death situation. And a doctor has to make that call of where does this fit? If it's the overall health of the mother, then can I make this decision today? Do I have to say I waited 10 hours because I wanted to be sure? You see what it's saying? Even in the best situations with the best intention, there can be confusion. And especially if that doctor works as part of a broader practice or a bigger hospital, there may be directives that are, making this even more difficult for a doctor who may have a natural instinct to do one thing, but now have to be a little bit concerned or questioning of that. There's a graphic I pulled for you just to show you this. This is from what was formerly Kaiser. Kaiser used to have this whole polling and research branch. And so this is their new branch. It goes by acronyms KKF. And this was taking a look at doctors. And so what you're seeing on your screen there is about a state abortion policy. And these are doctors answering this question, whether they personally experience constraints on management of miscarriages since the Dobbs decision, that's a decision in 2022, or whether or not they're concerned about their own legal risk when making decisions about patient care and necessity of an abortion. So you can see there that over 60% of these doctors um, feel like there's concern about this, concern about whether or not they're doing the right thing. And let me see if I can actually pull this up even more for you, because I'd like to show that. Um, this is they're saying basically they're not only concerned about, just for further clarification here, not only just concerned about the actual abortion ban, but also concerned about the sort of treatment they can do during a certain period of the pregnancy. So it's not just about an abortion or miscarriage care, which is different, but can often use similar equipment or similar procedures, or even at times similar coding for insurance purposes. It's also about care that has to do even at a different point in the pregnancy. And so this isn't to justify whether, a decision that a doctor makes. It's just to express that there's actual medical doctors that are concerned about whether or not they're making the right call legally. And sometimes that can be at odds with the care that they believe that they should just be providing. And that's where the space that we're in right now with where we are in these laws. So what I mean by that is, in a certain situation, if a person can prove they've been harmed by a law, then they can challenge that law. They have standing. But until there's that situation that a person can prove that, oftentimes the judge will not allow a case to be pursued in a criminal court. So what we're waiting for is the actual application of these laws and whether or not someone feels they've been personally hurt or harmed by them. And then that challenge will be played out in court. And yes, that challenge could be a challenge that we could see maybe in the Supreme Court someday. And maybe does this law over abortion evolve again? That's all possible. And the Supreme Court opened that possibility where precedent is not king based on their ruling of Roe v. Wade. So you could see in your lifetime, remember, Supreme Court justices sit for their lifetime, for as long as they want to serve. So we have a couple pretty young Supreme Court justices, but we can't tell the future. And they can also resign or step down. And so could you see in your lifetime another abortion law that makes it in front of the Supreme Court and that could challenge existing law? Absolutely. And could the Supreme Court justices be different, and that could lead to a different domino effect in the states? Yeah, maybe it could. And so it's interesting to kind of understand, though, what's happening here at the highest court in the land, and that's what's also happening in doctor rooms all over the country. This is also an interesting, I just wanted to present this because I'm going to put this Bloomberg article into our show notes so you could read it as well. And I'm going to pull it up here so you could see what I'm reading. I was curious because I know a lot of us have likely seen some scary scenarios that have been presented of women saying they could not receive care, or there was a pregnancy that was not going to develop in a healthy way, or a pregnancy that had no longer developed. And the doctors in a state were saying, well, we cannot uh, aid an abortion because of the current laws. And so I know we probably have stumbled upon any number of these stories online, and it can be very difficult to understand, well, what's the state of abortion in America, and what about these cases? And I think that's also important when we could talk about gestational care. It's not just about someone that is pregnant and maybe does not want that pregnancy. Miscarriages can unfortunately happen at any time. There's that question of how these laws apply when someone has a pregnancy that has developed for several months, but then no longer looks like it's a healthy pregnancy. And families are having to make very difficult decisions and are limited on what decisions they can make based on the new laws in their state. And so you're seeing it's not just about the early pregnancies. It's also about pregnancies that have developed, maybe far into, second trimester, third trimester. And so that's what was interesting about this Bloomberg article, because what they were taking a look at is, infant deaths and abortions in America, and in the aftermath of this new ruling, that both have actually risen after Roe's reversal. So abortion rates have actually gone up even with states restricting abortions in a much more prevalent way. Remember, other states have made it more permissive for you to get an abortion, but in the states, the news items really are about the states that are restricting it. But infant deaths have already risen. So what is that about? And I was very curious about it. This is the part of the article I thought was interesting. The author says, and the journalist here says, the answer is complicated. First, the rise in abortions appears to be largely due to a rise in abortion pills prescribed via telehealth appointments. Now, what did the pandemic do for everybody? Put us on Zoom, right? Telehealth all the time. So even if you're in a state where this is not available to you, you have a telehealth option. And the journalist writes, for the most part, abortion pills are only available to women within the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. So the point here is there's a rise in telehealth medicine and an access still to the abortion pill. So therefore, abortion rates are actually higher. Then she goes on to say here, but many congenital anomalies aren't detected until well after the 12-week mark. Fetal growth scans, the anatomy ultrasounds that doctors use to make sure a fetus is growing properly don't occur until about 18 to 22 weeks of pregnancy, sometimes even later. And so one of the hypotheses that this author was thinking about is, are some of these pregnancies having to be carried to term now or further into the pregnancy, where now they're being categorized as infant mortality rather than an abortion? If a woman was going to make that decision. And so you're both seeing abortion rates rise and also infant mortality rise. Marianne is saying there's a huge difference between miscarriage cases and elective abortions. Honestly, the medical terminology is so insensitive. It is true, and this is important for our next topic, which is going to get us to the Comstock Act. We're going to go to the 1870s, you guys, and we're leading right there because Marianne's setting us up just correctly. I had several people write in and ask me this. I had a young woman asking me about a friend referencing the Comstock Act and abortion. She wanted to know what that was all about. I had a mother writing in saying that a family's daughters were stocking up on birth control and also on the abortion pill just in case. And she was trying to figure out why. And so there was all these questions of what is this? Why is there a concern about abortion pill access? And what is the Comstock Act? This is all actually related. It is important to point out that in some cases, the terminology, even though you're looking at different scenarios, can be very similar. So there's a procedure called a DNC, and that can be used to remove tissue from the uterus. It also can be used to have an abortion. It also can be used to help a miscarriage that's already happened. So but it's the same procedure. It's technically, and with some of the tools that are being used, but the scenarios are very, very different. In one case, someone doesn't even have to be pregnant. It's just removing tissue from the uterus. So when we're using these terminologies, this is where now we're getting another layer of the law. So let's go into this. The Comstock Act in 1873 was an anti-obscenity law, and it prohibits the mailing and receiving of obscene, lewd writing or any article or thing designed or intended for the prevention of conception, so any contraceptives, or procuring an abortion. The references to contraception were actually removed in 1971, but the abortion language just stayed. And so if we're going to read it again, a law that prohibits the mailing and receiving of any article or thing designed or intended for procuring an abortion. So we could think, okay, that's going to be medicine, or it could be supply. What about supplies that are used for an abortion procedure? Well, wait a minute. The procedure that's done for an abortion is similar to a procedure that could be done for a miscarriage, similar to a procedure that could be done for a different treatment. So how would we know? How would we know if that equipment's going to where, and what is that about? So this did come up in the aftermath of the 2022 ruling in the Supreme Court. The Department of Justice basically came out with not a legal decision, but basically like an opinion on this. They tried to get in front of it and said, the Comstock Act does not prohibit the mailing or delivery of abortion medications unless the sender intends that that drug will be used unlawfully. So basically saying the only way you could prosecute this is that if you know that this particular medicine is going to be used in an unlawful fashion. But the reality is, in this particular case for this medicine, it could actually be used to aid a miscarriage. So who's going to be checking up on this? And how are you going to confirm this? And what kind of investigative tools are going to be used to track this down? Like, how does that all work? So the DOJ was trying to get ahead of that a little bit. But there are some groups that have asked the federal courts to interpret the Comstock Act as a ban on mailing and distributing the quote unquote abortion pill, or any of these drugs that are used in an abortion regimen. Where this has gotten a little bit stuck is that you have these groups saying this is against the law. But remember what I said, someone has to prove that there's been harm. So someone has to say, well, having access to this harms me, like this law harmed me. And it can't just be like, well, we think this is against the law. There has to be standing to say that. And so this is where these cases get a little bit tricky, because how do you prove that someone was hurt by access to this? How do you prove that it was being used on purpose to go around the law in that state by that person at that time, in this moment, at the pregnancy? It gets a little complicated. It doesn't mean that we're not going to see these cases mature, but it would be a very interesting argument to see how someone could say, for example, as a doctor, I feel like my patients have been harmed, or my practice has been harmed, or I've been harmed personally for treatment because my patients have access to this through telehealth into a state where it's not, abortions aren't permitted after a certain time in the pregnancy. It gets very tricky is what I'm saying. Tricky is that word again. So we're going to have to watch this one. But there doesn't seem to be an immediate challenge right now that would be sweeping in a federal sense that could impact this sort of commerce that is actually happening right now through telehealth and through the delivery of the mail. So it's something to watch, but not something that seems to be pending with a great deal of urgency. But if you have someone whose children or young women feel this way, this is why they're acting this way. This is why they're deciding to make that decision about stockpiling it or being concerned about it or anticipating it. There's the anticipation of it that may or may not come to fruition. But this is why they're thinking about that. So hopefully that can be a little bit helpful. Again, it's an interesting law put in place that still isn't that. It's such a lesson of like, oh, we're going to remove the language about contraception, but like, we don't really need to remove the language about abortion because abortion is a constitutional right. So it doesn't really matter. And then later you're like, oh, well, I guess we should remove that language because this is adding a layer of complication to the legal process that we didn't anticipate. And now we have all these other questions. So just for an overview, 41 states have abortion bans in effect with limited exceptions. 13 states have total abortion bans. Texas is the only, we have some exceptions in the state of Texas, threat to the physical health or life of the mother. Idaho's only exceptions are pregnancy resulting from rape or incest during the first trimester. 28 states have abortion bans based on gestational duration. So that, how far along you are in your pregnancy. As I mentioned, we have to be really careful because the news coverage right now is focused and, there's a good argument for it to be focused on the states with very restrictive bans on abortion because that's new. You also have to know that certain states are making abortion more permissive. So a state like California or New York, making it more accessible, maybe even further on in the pregnancy or maybe there's more exceptions. And so you have to be careful about it. I know when people say wild things about all sorts of different states and what they're doing regarding abortion. So you really have to look at the details of the law. 8 states ban abortion at or before 18 weeks gestation, and 20 states ban abortion at some point after 18 weeks. So in those particular states, 20 states still ban abortion at some point after 18 weeks. All right. Any questions on that before I move on, guys? There's a lot to talk to about this. I know it's a big one. But it is linked to, and I know I see a lot of personal stories that are coming up on the screen here. That's it when it comes to abortion and where there's a conversation about abortion, which is a pregnancy that is not wanted by that particular person, and then a miscarriage, which in not all cases, but is a wanted pregnancy, and you put these people in the same room who have want the same access to healthcare. These are very different scenarios. It brings up a lot of different emotions. I just want to recognize that. And it's a really tough subject because we're talking about all sorts of questions about where is the line between the government and personhood? Where does the government step in and have a say in what could be in what will be in any way a life-changing decision when it comes to pregnancy. So it's not an easy one, and I hope this adds a little bit of clarity to this. So, um, and I see already there's a constitutional argument about abortion, about where is it actually in the Constitution? No, the word abortion doesn't exist in the Constitution, which is what the Supreme Court was referencing when they have gave their decision about this. Let's talk about how this could apply, what we're seeing with abortion law, to marriage equality and gay marriage. These are both terms that are used, so I wanted to use both of them. I have a couple different letters on this. Hi, Jenna. Thanks so much for doing this. I have a tricky time, tricky, with a dear friend of mine who voted differently than myself. She is gay and married. She is terrified her marital rights are going to be taken from her. She's also scared because historians have said Trump is mirroring some of Hitler's actions. That's a quote that she's putting in. And she's afraid of the direction our country will move in with Trump in office. She is wanting to move out of the country. I do not believe her rights are in jeopardy, but maybe I'm wrong. Please feel free to paraphrase. Thank you. Hopefully someone else has the same thoughts here. And what I will tell you, T, I'm going to use her name because just in case, is we had a bunch of questions on exactly the same thing. But I loved how clearly you care about your friends and wanted to ask about this. I also got a question from Kristen. I'm starting to get worried that Trump can take away my gay child's ability to marry. When I read up on it, I feel like I only see extremes. What's the actual truth? It's really tough. Isn't that hard? Where you're like, I just want the answer and you can't find it. One more here. My brother was my best friend. He's gay and married and lives nearby. I love him, love his husband. They have cut me and my sister out of their lives since Trump won. They convinced their marriage and all gay rights will be taken away by Trump. My support of Trump was never an issue before. They hate him. I knew that. We were able to have conversations, but since he won, they've thrown us away. He said our morals and values aren't something they want in their lives, and we are no longer speaking because my sister and I don't support them, their marriage, or the LGBTQ community, which is not true at all. Ugh, Jennifer, I'm sorry to hear that. So let's talk a little bit about this because these are very heartfelt, and I want to make sure to provide some perspective. And again, we can't solve everything. We're not going to be able to referee and say this is what's going to happen, definitively, but let's just kind of zoom way out, okay? To ensure or deny the right to gay marriage is not within the president's power. So the president, so for what Kristen was saying about, Trump's ability to take away her gay child's right to marry, that's not something that unilaterally he can do. Where the president can affect things is through the Supreme Court, which we'll get to in a second. Right now, gay marriage in America is a constitutional right as guaranteed through a decision at the Supreme Court. So an executive order can't overturn that. A set in law in Congress can't overturn that. It is the law of the land. Now, I just told you about a Supreme Court decision that overturned a constitutional right. And that's why there's concern about this now. But I want to add a couple caveats and make this a little bit different. So the Supreme Court would have to overturn its own ruling, would have to get a case that would challenge it on its own ruling. And it would have to reverse its precedent, which is what it did in Roe v. Wade. That's the first time we've seen the Supreme Court do it. So now there's precedent to do it. But it's also been rare, and I think that's important to point out. That said, a case has to mature to reach the Supreme Court. And what I mean by that is a case can come up, and let's say a case comes up in the state of Texas, because that's where I'm at, and goes through the Texas courts, and then it's getting to a higher level federal court. It's not just about a state law in Texas. It just happens to be based here, challenging the way that the laws are being applied and whether or not constitutional rights are being denied or granted, or however it's being dissected. It has to go through a process to get to the Supreme Court. It can't just be filed and then suddenly winds up there. So in the case that we saw for Dobbs at the Supreme Court in 2022, again, it was 2018 to 2022. It was 4 years before that case actually reached the Supreme Court. So it does take some time. And what's really important about this is, after that case, do you remember that second case I told you about when it came to abortion law, the one out of Pennsylvania? As soon as that Supreme Court decision came down in the 1990s, the states increasingly became more involved in abortion law in their states. And almost immediately you started seeing all these challenges like, oh, we're going to, we're going to restrict abortion to, let's say, 24 weeks. Well, wait a minute. We're actually deciding it's going to be 20 weeks now because medical, technology and healthcare allow viability at a much earlier stage. No, we're in Mississippi. We're going to do 15 weeks. And eventually it gets to this point where there's a confrontation in the courts. And then now, 20, 30 years later, it's winding up in the Supreme Court again with a challenge. So there has to be this whole, basically there has to be a legal process that takes place. And right now, where in the past where it's on abortion, I could say, well, a Mississippi law could reach the Supreme Court. Well, there was another case, I'm just making this up, in another state. There were all sorts of cases in different states. It's just the Mississippi one made it to the Supreme Court first. When it comes to gay marriage, there's no cases that are pending right now that we know of that could actually reach that point, the Supreme Court. That looks like it's heading there. It has to start somewhere. You have to look and see it somewhere and say, oh, if that's cases happening in California, that's one to watch because it could make it to the Supreme Court. In abortion, I had several that I could pick from. Mississippi made it first. In this particular topic, I don't have an example to say that one could mature to the place that it's going to get to the Supreme Court. Doesn't mean there's not one that could appear on the horizon. It just means right now we don't see it. Gay marriage is also both confirmed through the Supreme Court decision that happened in 2015 and protected in a new federal law that was passed just recently. So after the abortion decision was handed down by the Supreme Court, and there was questions about gay marriage and also about just different protections, Supreme Court rulings, Congress, despite Congress being, as you know, not getting along at times, actually passed some new legislation that was federal legislation. And there's some similarities and some differences in how that legislation sort of interacts with the Supreme Court decision. I think it's really important. So the Supreme Court decision in 2015 held that the 14th Amendment requires a state to license a marriage between two people of the same sex. So states, you have to do this. It's a constitutional right. You got to do it. You can't tell me no. That's what the Supreme Court said. But number two, recognize the valid marriages of same-sex couples married in another state. So if someone married in the state of California early on, then their marriage is going to be recognized somewhere else. This is what the Supreme Court said in 2015. In 2022, for the Respect for Marriage Act, it guarantees the federal recognition of gay marriage. So if your child was married and there was some sort of change to the constitutional right to gay marriage, the federal government, according to this legislation, would still recognize it. So maybe the state wouldn't, but the federal government would. The second part of this law is that it requires states to accept the legitimacy of a valid marriage performed elsewhere. So it almost echoes the Supreme Court decision. So the legislation does not say, hey, states everywhere, you got to do this. The Supreme Court decision already did that. But let's say in the event that Supreme Court decision is overturned, the federal law codifies the other part of the Supreme Court decision and says you have to recognize a valid marriage license in another state in your state. So it doesn't force a state to say forever and ever and ever, regardless of Supreme Court decisions, like you have to provide a marriage license. But if there's any like sort of upheaval in that constitutional right that is guaranteed at this time, it would still require states to recognize somebody else's license. That may not, for some, that may not be good enough. Just the potential that a constitutional right could be overturned could be nerve-wracking and upsetting. And so that's where that's coming from. Like, wait a minute, if the constitutional right falls, like, couldn't another federal law be passed through a different Congress that could say something else? And that's true. But we're in the land of a lot of hypothetics there, which we just don't have any building blocks to even put in place to say this is, I can see there's like a little foundation place for that. Like, got to watch that story. I'm not saying it can never happen. I would never say that. But I'm just saying right now, again, on the horizon, that's not what we're seeing. And we're going to have to see, we'll have to see if there's enough momentum for advocacy groups that's, for example, don't want gay marriage to be a constitutional right to get behind a legal case that, again, would mature enough to get to the Supreme Court. So Today, as of right now, same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, meaning it can only be overturned by the Supreme Court, not by federal law, and not by the president. The way that the president could impact the future of this is by the opportunity to appoint more Supreme Court justices that, in the event that a case gets in front of them, may rule similarly to how they decided in looking at the Dobbs case and say, how the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution was wrong in the past, and here's our new precedent for it. It's not a quick process. And again, a lot of things have to happen at the same time. But that's how the president can affect this conversation. So, also important to note, if there was something that happened with the Constitution, a decision being overruled, 35 states have statutes or constitutional amendments on the books prohibiting same-sex marriage, which would immediately become enforceable. So even though the Supreme Court handed down this decision, a lot of legislation in different states hasn't caught up, kind of similar to the Comstock Act. They're like, well, it's a Supreme Court decision. It's constitutionally, like, it's a right. We're not going to get rid of that law. It doesn't matter, but we're going to keep it in place. And so if any, I don't want to say calling it an insurance policy is too glib, but basically, like, the law is not relevant anymore. It only becomes relevant if that that ruling on the Constitution is overturned. And if it does, you're talking about 35 states. Under the 2022 law that was passed in Congress, states are not required to license same-sex marriages. Remember, that's important, just to accept them from other states. So hope that could be helpful to kind of clarifying that. It's hard to know the future. So if you have a family member or a friend that's concerned about this concern is coming from how the Supreme Court has decided recent cases where a constitutional right was thought and believed to be guaranteed, and then it was not. So that's where it's coming from. It's not just coming from, theory. It's coming from something that actually happened. At the same time, while understanding that concern, another point to consider is just the amount of time it takes for a case to get in front of the Supreme Court, and what has to take place for it to reach there. And even when a case can reach the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court, let me see if I can grab this fact. It's incredible. The Supreme Court, I hope I can grab it. I have so many different notes. The Supreme Court sees so many different cases. Let me check one more place. It's incredible to see how many different cases that are, thousands of cases that the Supreme Court could basically consider. And they choose like a dozen a year. So even if a case is like, this should be in the Supreme Court, it doesn't automatically get there. The Supreme Court has to be, yeah, okay, I'll hear that. And sometimes they're like, no, we're not going to hear that now. So there's a lot of things that have to happen. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. I know there's a big question there about, what is that going to look like? Okay. Any other comments before we leave? I had a couple questions. I know we've gone a long time. I've had a couple questions about Tulsi Gabbard being a Russian spy. That's come up. I've had questions about RFK banning vaccines. That's another question that came up that we could touch on real briefly. We can also hold those for a separate family meeting and see, will Robert F. Kennedy Jr. actually lead Health and Human Services? This is a great question, Angela. What has the president-elect said about the stance on gay marriage? I meant to mention that. This is not a topic that President Trump has talked a lot about. And I'd be interested to see, because it also hasn't been a topic because it's not geared to a particular news item, where, states are doing all these different things and there's all these questions about abortion. It's kind of in the news, and, on a debate stage, we're going to ask them about abortion because this is something that could come up. This hasn't been asked just because it hasn't been part of the recent news cycle. So I really need to look back in the past to see what he has said about it, because it's not a topic that really came up in this election cycle. And whether or not that reflects a priority of the American public or a priority of a party, but both parties didn't really bring it up. So I'm going to have to look at that and see, and we'll see how how it gets, how it gets applied. So in the future. Okay. Why don't we just finish up with this just a last quick comment. Um, One of the things that seems to be I think it's going to be one of our big goals here at SmartHER News is to really talk about the way that government works, because we all need a review on that to understand not only how the legal system works, but also how is the government working. So to understand, even the power that a new cabinet secretary can have, we need to understand, well, what's happening underneath that person? How do laws apply there? Who's funding different projects, and where's that money coming from, and how is it green lit, and what are all these things? These are really where I think you guys need actually more substance. I've always said that, like more substance rather than less substance when it comes to conversations that we're having, because it's understanding the nuances of it that give us an idea of what's actually possible and what's actually the questions that we should be asking. And I really noticed that because I need to review the legislative process, the judicial process. Like, how do all these things happen? There's a process to it. And even though there's this perception that's like just totally wild and no one's following any rules, there actually are procedures that are in place by the government and checks and power on purpose. And that's one of the brilliance of the United States government. So it's not flawless and it's constantly developing, but there are those checks in place. And I think it's important to point out. All right. Just a quick final thought. I thought you'd find this interesting. This week, as we go into Thanksgiving, on this particular week, we actually had a very interesting date, it was the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And I don't know if you know the backstory about the Gettysburg Address, but it's pretty fascinating. So you have this terrible battle that took place, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. And, lasting over July 1st to the 3rd, just ironically, we think about July 3rd and the 4th as being the most important, dates in America's independence going back to 1776. So here, this terrible battle is happening. You have brothers fighting brothers, cousins fighting cousins. There's 100,000 people involved in this battle. The average age of someone who dies is like 25, 26 years old. It's just terrible. And the aftermath of it and trying to figure out what to do with the bodies is like a huge, huge task for Gettysburg. And right away, there was this recognition that what happened on that land had to be preserved, and those that fought there had to be honored, even though they were at a disagreement, and even though the Civil War still raged. Yes, the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point where the Confederacy was suddenly not so strong anymore. Confederacy had all these surprising wins at the beginning, and then Gettysburg happened, and it was a shift of momentum that really was historic, and it mattered because eventually, as you know, the Confederacy surrenders, but it's a couple of years later. And so there's this recognition we're going to need to honor what happened here in some way. What do we do? And the local folks decided, well, we're going to have a cemetery. We're going to have to figure out what to do here. And by November, they're opening a soldier cemetery. And there's a lawyer in Gettysburg who writes the president. I want you to think about this. Okay. Writes President Lincoln. It's like November 2nd or 3rd or something like this, early in November. And he's like, hey, would you like to come to this event? You're going to be opening this cemetery. And President Lincoln's like, okay. And in 2 weeks, the president shows up, actually stays at the lawyer's house, where there's believed that he put the final touches on the Gettysburg Address. And then he goes out and obviously President Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. And the reason why I bring this up is, we talk about how divisive these times are. And I was preparing for the family meeting and I was thinking about all these different topics and how to cover them in a way that would be, educational, but stay true to journalism and also provide some perspective during a time that's really stressful. And I thought, there's always a gift. History always gives you such a gift when it's happened, when you're able to remember something that was so significant in the past and just remember it for a second. None of us experienced a Civil War, but many of us are probably fascinated with that time period and the history there. And when we talk about divisiveness and fighting, family fighting over different topics, I know it can be really stressful. I know it can be very difficult. I want you to think about what it was like in 1863. I think sometimes the fear of having that happen again, the fear of what could happen in World War II. Could we ever see Hitler again? Are we ever going to see the rise of fascism again? Could we ever see a civil war in America? Even though we didn't experience those things in a front row seat, even just understanding a little bit of the trauma of that time makes you want to ward off against any of the second coming of any of that. And I think that's part of sometimes why there's such a voracious language being used, because it's like, hey, we learned. We're not trying to go back there again. We're not trying to have any of this stuff happen again. But history is really important because all stories are unique. And there's very seldom a repeat of a story. There's similar patterns that can come up, but every story has very different people in it. And that really matters. And so we have to kind of keep our eyes open of not trying to think about repeating the past, but understanding that we're in a new storyline. And that storyline includes the past, but it's not the past. And the fighting that we saw with our families that actually existed in the Civil War is a different sort of fighting than we're going to experience in Thanksgiving, hopefully for all of us. I mean, that it's not going to be dangerous or deadly in the way that the Civil War was. I mean, think about that. It's the equivalent, the Civil War was the equivalent of killing between 6 and 7 million Americans right now. You know, we talk about political disagreements, different views, different thoughts about the future. Like that was all happening there. And I hope that in these relationships, some of which, a brother and sister breaking their relationship over a perception of a value, I hope there's maybe some room for reconciliation. And sometimes time is just that. Unfortunately, with all of these stories, it's just going to take a little bit of time for them to develop in a way that we can even report them more robustly, because a lot of the situations we're dealing with, where there's a lot of anxiety, are based on new things that have happened that have led to new situations that people are trying to navigate. And there's not total certainty on it yet. This is whether, the abortion laws are being applied. These are some questions about the Comstock Act. Who even thought about the Comstock Act? So it's unfortunate. I wish I had more conclusive information to deliver to you many of the times. But a lot of the times right now, when we're coming to our reporting, it's just we're at a certain point of a stage of development in the story, and there's no rushing it. It just has to develop. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful to you. I look forward to your feedback, and I hope that you guys will continue some of these conversations that you're having, even just on our live chat now or amongst your family members. I'll make sure to cut this down so that you have it in some easy ways to consume. I know this has been a long broadcast, but I appreciate you staying with me this entire time. And I hope wherever you are and however you celebrate, you have a very happy Thanksgiving. I'm so grateful for all of you and for your support of SmartHER News. And thank you for helping to build this dream and really present a solution in news. All right, guys, have a great rest of your day. And I'll talk to you soon. I'll see you with more on smarthernews.com. Bye, guys.